My name is Drew Sikkema. I am a student at Muskegon Community College in Professor Troutman's American History class, and my presentation is about the Lewis and Clark Expedition. To grasp the full concept of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, it is important to take a look at what events led to its formation. It is important to note that there were three major powers at play here: France, Spain, and Britain. These three world powers wanted access to the river systems in Louisiana and Missouri for trading purposes. In 1975, a conflict between the United States and Spain broke out and was settled by Spain agreeing to let the United States use the river systems and use New Orleans as an ocean port. This system worked fine until France, having been done with the 7-Year War, was eager to reestablish its presence in America. In 1802, King Napoleon of France convinced Spain's King Charles IV to transfer the territory to him. France, having controlled New Orleans, revoked U.S. access to the ports and warehouses, which angered U.S. citizens greatly. To fix this problem, President Jefferson sent Secretary of State James Madison to Paris to negotiate with Napoleon. His task was to purchase land west of the Mississippi. If that failed, he was to try to buy either just New Orleans or at least access to the rivers and the port. He was given $10 million to negotiate with. Upon Madison's arrival, he found that France was being torn apart by slave uprisings and a threat of another conflict with Britain. This caused Napoleon to give up his dream for a French empire in America and sell all the land to the United States. On April 30, the negotiations were made final and the U.S. gained 827,000 square miles for $15 million. So what is the Lewis and Clark Expedition and why was it formed? In 1804, President Thomas Jefferson tasked Meriwether Lewis with exploring the lands west of the Mississippi River. The reasoning behind this was the U.S. just purchased a great amount of land from France. It did not know what it contained. For all they knew, anything could be there. The chances for new discovery were through the roof. It only makes sense to send someone to explore it. President Jefferson thought it was important to discover what they had just bought to see if it held any valuables. Above all else, President Jefferson hoped to find a waterway that ran all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This would be a valuable asset for trading. Another goal was to establish diplomacy with Native Americans. Lewis selected a man by the name of William Clark to be his co-leader for the mission. They wasted no time putting together a team and setting off on their way. In total, the excursion lasted 2 years and they covered 8,000 miles of land. They were confronted with harsh conditions, unforgiving landscapes, injuries, starvation, disease, and more. Overall, the journey was deemed a success for the new geological, ecological, and social information gathered. Meriwether Lewis was born in Virginia in 1774, but spent his early childhood in Georgia. After spending some time there, he moved back to Virginia to pursue an education as a teenager. He attended a school called Liberty Hall Academy, which is now called Washington and Lee University. Upon his completion in 1793, at age 19, he joined the Virginia militia. He was a key contributor in putting down the Whiskey Rebellion and went on to become a captain in the U.S. Army. When he was 27, he became the personal secretary of President Thomas Jefferson. William Clark was also born in Virginia, but he was born in 1770, making him 4 years older than Lewis. When he turned 15, Clark and his family moved to Kentucky, where at age 19, he joined the militia. Clark was born into a poor family and did not have the resources to get an education. Eventually, he upgraded from the militia to the U.S. Army, where he met and served with Lewis, where they became great friends. Clark was eventually commissioned by President George Washington as a lieutenant of infantry. Preparations. When Lewis was given the task to explore the 827,000 square mile section of newly gained land, he knew he was up against a big challenge and could not do it himself. The first person he asked to join him was his old friend Clark. From there, the two began prepping for the journey. They studied things like medicine and botany, as well as any existing maps of the region. They also set about gathering supplies. They brought maps, books, weapons, clothes, food, as well as trading gifts for people they might encounter. Such things included beads, ivory combs, mirrors, and more. Their next task was to recruit men for their expedition. They looked for unmarried men in good health that could hunt and knew survival skills. In total, the group consisted of 45 men, which included Lewis and Clark, as well as a French-Indian interpreter, and a contracted boat crew, and a slave owned by Clark named York. Altogether, the company was named the Corps of Discovery. The Path Westward. On May 14, 1804, the crew assembled in St. Charles, Missouri, and headed upstream on the Missouri River in a keelboat and two smaller boats. The crew traveled an average of pace of 15 miles a day and faced terrible conditions, blistering heat, large masses of bugs, and strong river currents made travel difficult to say the least. As mentioned before, their goal was to travel by river to the Pacific Ocean. The route by river took them north, just shy of British territory, which is modern-day Canada. The Missouri River then took a westward hook and stayed level until they reached the Pacific. Along the way, they passed from the Missouri River to the Columbia River, which ran through Oregon country, finally into the Pacific. On their journey, their destination on the Pacific was called Fort Clatsop. On their journey back, they both traveled by way of the Columbia River, but when they reached the end of the Columbia River, Lewis and Clark split ways. Lewis took the northern Missouri River, and Clark took the lower Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone River ended up spitting Clark out further down the Missouri River, and the group met back up and finished the journey back together. Indian Relations. A side mission of the Lewis and Clark expedition was to promote diplomacy with the Native Americans. Over the course of their trip, Lewis and Clark ran into around 50 different tribes with mixed results. Some of these tribes were the Shoshone, the Mandan, the Blackfeet, and the Sioux. Lewis and Clark developed a system for meeting the new tribes, where they would bring gifts and things to trade. They also made a point of telling them that the U.S. now owned their land, and then they offered military protection in return for peace. Most natives they met were nice and openly friendly. However, there were certain groups that were openly hostile towards them. Lewis and Clark depended heavily on the natives to survive during their journey. The natives taught them what plants they could eat, gave them food, traded with them for new supplies, and much more. There was even a young Native American named Sacagawea that traveled with them, who got them out of some pretty sticky situations. She was the wife of a French-Canadian trapper and a Shoshone Indian. Later in their journey, she would prove invaluable when they run into a band of Shoshone Indians. Discoveries and accomplishments. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a huge success. They met their primary goal to find a water system that led to the Pacific and much more. Over the course of the journey, Lewis identified 178 plants new to science, including bitterroot, sagebrush, Douglas fir, and ponderosa pine trees. In addition to this, he identified 122 new animals. These included the grizzly bear, prairie dog, and pronghorned antelope. Since they were the ones discovering things, many of the geographic locations of today are named after group members. One example of this is a creek they named after their dog. Their dog was named Seaman, and the creek is called Seaman Creek. On their return to St. Louis, when they returned to St. Louis, Congress rewarded them with double the pay and double the land reward. The two captains, Lewis and Clark, got 1,600 acres of land, and the men in the company got 320 acres of land. The total cost for the expedition was $38,000. Additional rewards for Lewis and Clark were that President Jefferson appointed Lewis governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory and appointed Clark an Indian agent. Most of the men who went on the journey became fur traders or joined the militia. So for my interview, I started calling every Lewis and Clark museum that listed a phone number. After a couple tries, I was lucky enough to get the executive director of the Lewis and Clark Boathouse and Museum in St. Louis, Missouri. His name was Robert Foster, and he was more than happy to discuss the Lewis and Clark expedition with me. Most of what he told me matched up to what I found online. However, he was able to provide me with a few interesting stories that he said not a lot of people knew about. One of these stories he told me was when Sacagawea saved the group from certain death. They were surrounded by a group of Shoshone Indians who were about to attack when Sacagawea recognized their leader as her brother that she had been separated from at 12. She was able to talk to him, and the Indian group ended up helping them. This is what I was talking about earlier in my slides. Another story was about Clark's slave who I mentioned, York. York was more of a friend to Clark than a slave, and joined Lewis and Clark even on important meetings. Robert told me that the Native Americans had never seen a person of color before, and they were very interested. Most places they went, the natives liked York quite a bit, and this proved useful during their journey. The last story he told me was an interesting piece of information, and it was that the first documented African American and woman Native American were allowed to participate in a vote. They were deciding on where to winter, and they allowed Sacagawea and York to cast a vote in the decision. So these are the sources I used for my presentation. The first two are from JSTOR, which is a journal in the MCC library database. It is a good place to look for articles because they are trustworthy and peer-reviewed. I got most of my information from these two and used the others to find minor details that made the presentation flow better. For my pictures, I mostly used the ones from websites I found information on, and I was also able to use a lot of what Robert told me in my interview. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it.